This is Angela Lansbury. This is part two of the world exclusive Khoodeelaar diagnosis of Fleet Street newspapers on Thursday, the 15th of October 2020. Now, this name Lansbury is very important. In the East End of London, there is a place called Poplar where George Lansbury was one of the councillors in the then borough of Poplar 100 years ago. And as a Poplar councillor, George Lansbury took part in a series of democratic action along with his fellow Poplar councillors in defense of the people of Poplar who were being penalized for being poor by the conservative government of the time. And the Poplar councillors took a stand in defense of the community. And in doing that, they incurred the wrath of the judicial system and they were jailed. They were sent to jail. I mean, how many historic, unique features are there in that statement? So Angela Lansbury, who is a Hollywood actress, is related to George Lansbury. That's the connection and explanation of the name Lansbury. Although she has been, on the whole, a decent person, as well as being an actress in Hollywood, that name enhances her kind of relevance to our campaign. We briefly witnessed her appearing in the East End of London, in the Bow Church a few years ago, and the efforts of taking pictures of her were thwarted by a racist woman who was working as freelance, connected with the local East London idiotizer. That racist came from either Italy or Greece or Spain, and we haven't yet finished with her. That racist actually treated the Bangladeshi community in Tower Hamlets as suspects, all of us as suspects. And that racist physically stood in front of me, blocking my view of Angela Lansbury. Now, I didn't want to physically push her away, but I did notice that, and I moved away myself because I didn't want to create a diversion from the proceedings. There were short proceedings, but there were proceedings about the Poplar councillors and George Lansbury, of course. I did manage to speak to Khoodeelaar, who is one of the politically dubious members of the Labour Party and an MP. So Khoodeelaar, at the time an MP, I don't know whether he is an MP still, I shall check. So I spoke to Khoodeelaar, and Khoodeelaar gave me a completely bogus kind of few minutes or bites, which I shall play in due course as part of the illustration. Now, why I'm saying about Lansbury? Because next year, our campaign is marking the work of the Poplar councillors. And we have been preparing to mark this as part of the Khoodeelaar campaign and the campaign in defense of the community in the East End of London. We are leading the organization. of the marking. And we have already kind of published quite a few comments contrasting the behavior of the councillors, popular councillors of the 1920s, and contrasting them totally favorably against the councillors that have followed them as councillors from various wards that now form part of the Tower Hamlets Council. And there is no evidence whatsoever of a single councillor on the Tower Hamlets Council, either now or in the last 80 years or 85 years, who has followed the example, the democratic example set by the popular councillors, of whom just George Lansbury was one. But we want to say to them, about them, collectively, that they are, and I have said it many times, I'm the only one who has said it, that people in Tower Hamlets, despite the fact that Tower Hamlets Council is a corrupt council, criminal council, but historically, people in the East End of London have a legitimate point of reference to be politically and ethically and morally very confidently proud of the record of the popular councillors. And if we can repeat the legacy and the lessons that they left behind, that would be the least we can do, and we must do that. Now, I have made about few dozen references in public about the popular councillors, and I have noticed that not one councillor has come back to me to even kind of continue the discussion, let alone to suggest anything in particular to commemorate the role of the popular councillors. Now, these people, popular councillors, whatever they were from different social backgrounds, economic backgrounds, but collectively in that stand, they kind of personified the best of local democracy. And that is the focal point of my interest and our campaign's interest in their role and their legacy. What has happened in Tower Hamlets in the last 80 to 100 years since the popular councillors took that stand is that there has been a manifest, brazen, and totally dishonest kind of pretense that the popular councillors didn't do what they did or they didn't exist. Now, I have said more than once on the facts that the role of the popular councillors in that particular battle against the Conservatives was unique, not only in London, but in the whole of the UK. Now, anyone who knows of another similar case is most welcome to contribute their contents, and I shall review and update my commentary accordingly. But as of now, and I'm aware, very much aware of the Liverpool councillors and the deputy leader, Derek Hatton, and their mass kind of sacking or redundancy notice that has been condemned by Neil Kinnock, 1985, I think, and he was the leader, Kinnock. Whatever the militant controlled, Liverpool Labour Party controlled council did was of a completely different description and order. It wasn't as universally applicable and laudable and as democratic as the role of the popular councillors, despite the fact that they weren't a collection of insiders or infiltrators or extremists. They did the democratic decent thing, and that is what marks them as being worth the reference and worthy of kind of recognition and exemplify. Their example needs to be repeated and updated, which is what I and the Khoodeelaar campaign have been doing, trying to kind of create a bigger impact than has been done so far by any of the councillors. Now, the role of the councillors in Tower Hamlets now could not be more kind of unlike the role of the popular councillors. In fact, the council ward, that is the council constituency ward for electoral purposes for council election, that is called Lansbury ward, is not called popular. The popular one that is called is the one that is further down the road or further south of the river, south of the road, let's say. And it is more like the council ward for the Canary Wharf. The one that is called the Lansbury ward contains the Crisp Street Market, and it is off the East India Dock Road, the Crisp Street Market. And on the southern side is a statue of George Lansbury. It was a statue of George Lansbury, not the statue of other councillors. That was probably because he later became the leader of the Labour Party, and that is probably the status thing that they were thinking of when they decided to build a statue in his memory rather than the collective memory of all the other councillors. Evidence available suggests that other councillors played as good or even better radical and democratic role than George Lansbury himself. But I'm not pointing this out as a kind of distinction between him and the others. It's just that I think that the other councillors, popular councillors, still deserve fuller recognition than they have been given in this kind of statue. And our plan, the Khoodeelaar campaign's plan, includes publication and hopefully, if the lockdown still continues, hopefully we shall be running television programs, on online channel programs and discussions. But that is to come in 2021. For today, in the Daily Mirror, Lansbury is kind of reaching the 95th birthday tomorrow, that is Friday, has a piece about Lansbury herself, but also a picture of her grandfather, George Lansbury, which is the least they could do. Let me see if they've got the sense to refer to the popular councillors. Her grandmother was Bessie, was a suffragette, and dad, Edgar, was a communist mayor in Poplar, East London, who died of cancer when Angela was 9. At 15, Mum, Moyna McGill, a former West End actress, took Angela to New York to escape the Blitz, and from there she went to Hollywood. At 19, she wed 35-year-old actor Richard Cromwell, but it ended less than a year later. Angela then fell for British actor Peter Shaw, SHAW, not Shore, who was the MP, one of the two MPs in Tower Hamlets. They had Angela Lansbury and Peter Shaw had two children, Anthony and Deirdre. Peter died of heart failure aged 84 in 2003 after 54 years of marriage. Angela has said, I think interested in every part of life, not just acting. My grandchildren, my life, cooking, driving. Her only regret has been not spending enough time with her family in the past. She explained, wanting to take the things that are dear and warm and loving, my family, and then having to do my job. You can't do it all, but she is certainly making up for it now. Now, there is no reference to the popular councillors. Let me read the rest of it again, just in case. She grew up in London, the granddaughter of working class hero George Lansbury, who led Labour from 1932 to 35. Angela has previously said the peace campaigner was her greatest inspiration, adding, this was the man who tried to stop the Second World War. He went and spoke with the leaders, Mussolini, Hitler, Roosevelt. He didn't give up. Many people feel it killed him. So that is the piece about Angela Lansbury, who turns 95 tomorrow. And we have checked, and the Daily Mirror has nothing about the popular councillors. It's only about her grandfather, George Lansbury, who is praised twice in that piece, but no mention of the popular councillors. And no mention, most significantly, of the battle. It's not peace campaign only. The biggest battle that made him politically known and established was the battle as a councillor, popular councillor. That is what made the difference. So what we shall be doing is to expose the likes of the Daily Mirror. This is supposed to be a Labour Party supporting newspaper. As we keep pointing out, the Mirror is strategically, commercially Labour supporting. It's not ideologically any different from the ideological narrative and agenda being run daily or in every issue by the likes of the Rupert Murdoch scum, that is Sun, and the poisonous legacy of the liar Beaverbrook and the Daily Express, or the Star, the racist little outfit called the Star, that I organized a campaign against in the 1980s and formed the organization in order to stop the Daily Star attacking a Bangladeshi family in the town of Hitchin in Hertfordshire on housing. And we shall be coming to discuss housing today. That was what? 1988. 98, 2008, 18, this is 32 years ago. And 2 years before the 1988, I organized and held a demonstration, the first of its kind ever held outside the BBC's, notice the name, White City-based headquarters at the time in 1986. It was actually Thursday, 22nd of May 1986. And that demonstration I had to organize in protest against the BBC 2 television channel, airing a 4-part series of attack on the Bangladeshis in Brick Lane and giving credit to a convicted racist. The racist is now convicted or since got convicted, but he was a racist nonetheless, even before he was formally convicted. Giving the racist credit for saving the Bangladeshis in Tower Hamlets, which is absurd in the extreme. So the Daily Mirror has never, the Daily Mirror has never actually published stuff that defend the ideology, the values, the ethics and the morality of the values that are resembling the founding values of the Labour Party. I mean, George Lansbury, being a leading Labour Party member in the 1920s, was a Labour Party member at the start of the Labour Party coming into political action. So the Daily Mirror lives out the main role of Lansbury there in defending the poor people in the East End of London who were being attacked by the Tory regime in power at the time. And just to emphasize the point that I make in the analysis, that the judicial system in this country is a corrupt, racist bureaucracy. And the Lansbury and his fellow popular councillors were sentenced to jail for representing their poor constituents in Poplar. So it's not just suddenly that the court system in Britain has become corrupt. It has been always corrupt, and it has always been against the poor, and it has always been an extension of the agenda and the narrative of the conservatives, whatever the name, Tory, conservative, or anything else. And they are sometimes called the Liberal Democrats, sometimes called the SDP, whatever. They are against the poor people, against the ordinary people, against the many. And they have been always, and they will always be. And the Daily Mirror is part of that. The Daily Mirror is part of that, despite the fact that it keeps pretending to support and back and align with the Labour Party. It does align with the Labour Party, and it kind of publishes tokenistic bits apparently appearing to be Labour Party positions about various things. But it only does that solely for commercial reason, in order to get the market, whatever the number of papers that it sells or the number of advertisements it may get, whatever the source says, it does that on the basis and for the niche claim that it makes commercially that it is not a Tory supporting paper and a group. That is Mirror Group and Mirror newspaper. Mirror Group includes the Sunday edition, Sunday Mirror and the Sunday People, and also the Saturday paper, and the currently now it also includes the two titles, the Daily Star and the Beaverbrook Poison paper called the Daily Express. Now, when we campaigned against the Star, which was still based in Fleet Street, at an address in Fleet Street, not far from what used to be called the headquarters of the Press Association of the Reuters in 85 Fleet Street, that's the opposite side of the street from Reuters and Press Association. And it is further down the road or up the road, depending on which way you are going, from the Peterborough kind of walk or close or whatever. Peterborough used to be associated with the Daily Telegraph being headquartered in Fleet Street. So that was in 1980s, 1988. And the campaign against the Star was prompted by the depiction of a Bangladeshi family in Hitchin getting council housing. And that was the Express Group, that is, the Star newspaper, objected to that. And we went there and demonstrated. I organized all of that. So that was the part of the campaign that we had formed a bit earlier about the BBC's King of the Ghetto. And we called it the Campaign Against Racist Media Attacks Against the Bangladeshis in the UK. The abbreviation actually neatly turns into a very active and positive Bangladeshi word, Korma Book. active in action and dedicated to action. Karma Book or Karma Book, that is the name of the organization that I set up. So when it says on the top line that I am author of thousands of theses and projects, this is one of the thousands that I created, and absolutely had no alternative but to create and carry out and implement and coordinate. Now the ethical vision of the kind of nasty, racist, hateful Fleet Street, the ethical, that is from the ethical standpoint, the unethical vision of Fleet Street, the British papers, is evident in the contents, the images. The prediction that we made, I mean, time to time, I have been having to make predictions as part of a kind of communication of concept in short, because most people that I have to communicate with or to don't necessarily have the intellectual patience or the stamina to run the course and stay the course of a discussion that is extensive. So I have devised many words and phrases over the years as part of the action program that conveys things very neatly in simple words. And one of the words that I devised, of course, is about the current editor of Private Eye. His name is Hislop. And in order to tell him to get away from his racist kind of contemptuous position, I devised the name Pissoff, Ian Pissoff. Now, Ian Pissoff is a colloquial word of swear word, yes? But it does neatly personify him, Ian Pissoff. So much so that in one letter at least, published in the 1970s or early 1980s, against Ian Pissoff's Private Eye covering whatever he was or the paper was saying, Gary Bushell was doing. Gary Bushell addressed Ian Pissoff as Ian Pissoff. Now that's not a coincidence. Gary Bushell knows me or knew me because he followed me as the editor of what is now the University of East London kind of student union paper. He was the editor. I was the elected editor a year before him. And I gave up after my year ended, and he edited the paper. So he knew who I was, and he actually agreed with me. The funny thing is that Gary Bushell's handwritten script, while he was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, have been among the papers that I have lost contact with, and we shall come to that, how I lost contact with. And Bushell wrote lengthy handwritten pieces while I was editor of the student union paper against the National Front Against the Racists and others, before he became a published source of racist pride. Now, that is something that we shall be dealing with after updating on the current behavior of Gary Bushell. But the fact is that even he followed my example and called Ian Pissoff instead of Hislop. And that sums up Ian Pissoff's kind of stature. Well, it's not just stature, he's a diminutive. He is probably as diminutive as John Biggs, who was historically called diminutive Mr. John Biggs by the Guardian's Dan Sabag, a former Lambeth councillor, now an executive on the Guardian, who wrote a piece in April 2018, weeks before the council election or mayor election in Tower Hamlets, in May 2018. And in an encounter he had with John Biggs in E3, he found him diminutive. Now, I have expanded on that and applied the evidence of John Biggs and his role in bringing down the standards and the stature of Tar Armlets Council. And I have found that it is absolutely apt to call John Biggs the diminutive John Biggs, because he diminished the office of the mayor and they diminished the status of the council. And so therefore, what we are doing here is looking at the reality on the ground and the fantasy that is kind of printed by the Fleet Street newspapers. And when I say Gary Bushell is a columnist on the Star on Sunday, I think. So the paper, the original paper that I campaigned against in '88, that was about 10 years or so after I left what is now the University of East London Students' Union. I had been elected in 1976. And the paper that was in place at the time that I was elected to edit, and I was elected to the post called the publications editor. Probably a very rare kind of journalistic job where almost a democratic election is held. And it was called the NEPAM, Northeast Polytechnic Activists Monitor. Now that was when the University of East London was an amalgamation of several local colleges, and it was called the Northeast London Polytechnic in 1976. And my first publication did a kind of factual, fact-based kind of denunciation of the then college authorities wasting money in the first week of September welcoming new students. And I ran the front page with the £1,000 a day freshers. That was a waste that I noticed at the time. That is what, 1976? And this is now 44 years ago. So even taking that kind of as the starting point, it wasn't a starting point, but as a milestone, I have been at it opposing wastes by public institutions, including academic institutions, for 44 years. But I have been at it even longer than that. Now, Gary Bushell has become, since he succeeded me in that post, he became a successful organizer of racist causes. And so therefore, I shall be updating on Gary Bushell in due course. And the pieces that he wrote as a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, he neatly forgot. And which is one of the reasons, the behavior of Gary Bushell is one of the reasons, evidential reasons, for my calling the socialist workers bogus and corrupt and racist. Because if it could have someone with Gary Bushell's potential as a racist, as a member of the SWP, then what about the others? And the behavior of the Socialist Workers' Party, others, Socialist Workers' Party, shows that they are essentially as racist as the others that they apparently kind of mount protests against. The only difference is that their business patch is based on the ground, that on the evidence that they actually solidarize with the targets of racism, like the Bangladeshis or the Indians or the Pakistanis or the Asians and the Africans and other people in various areas where there are significant numbers of African and Asian people living in boroughs like Newham, like Tower Hamlets, like Hackney, like Islington, and up in the Midlands in the Birmingham, and in Manchester, Leeds, and so forth. The Socialist Workers' Party in 76 was known as the IS, chilling similarity with the Islamic kind of state. But of course, that was 76, and the IS was called International Socialists. And the International Socialists changed their name to Socialist Workers' Party, which got kind of readily mocked as the Socialist WA S party. This word cannot be repeated before the live television broadcast camera, but it is a colloquial word that is not very dignified. And the Socialist W party have not changed their racist behavior and orientations and the service to the cause of imperialist white socialist liberation. The Australian-based or Australian-originated member of the Workers' Revolutionary Party, not the SWP, but the Workers' Revolutionary Party, which was based for a while in at an address in the London Borough of Wandsworth, not far from the place where the town hall is, Wandsworth. And they kind of published a number of articles about the SWP and the SWP in the USA. And they accused both of the SWPs, both in the USA and the UK, as related to the American CIA and the British spying outlet here. To what extent that is factually provable is not possible to say here, because we haven't seen any democratic kind of assessment accompanied by any evidential documentary or whatever. That is what we are saying. But the persistent pattern of the British SWP in sabotaging anti-racist groups and campaigns suggests that they are doing, even if they are not operating directly hand in hand with the Secret Service in the UK, but they are operating the same agenda of sabotaging African people, Asian people, Muslim people by intercepting them, by intruding them, and by acting as agents provocateurs. That is what they have been doing, which is why there has been no anti-racist movement developed in this country while the SWP has been involved, because they invented their own marketing tool called the Anti-Nazi League. And when they were doing that in the 70s in Tower Hamlets, they weren't present when Altavali was murdered in Whitechapel. And since then, they have been claiming all kinds of authorship of doing the campaign after Altavali was murdered. That shows their contempt and disrespect to and for the people in whose name they do the politicking. So when we say that this is an exclusive, world exclusive diagnosis of Fleet Street coming from the East End of London, organized and delivered by the Khoodeelaar campaign, we mean that. We have got evidence there from the day's newspapers, and we have got historical connections, exclusive revelations about Gary Bushell that we have just made. You cannot find this anywhere else. You won't find it because nobody else would have access to that information. I had the information available to me because Gary Bushell wrote the pieces while I was editor and submitted that for my approval, etc., etc. So I knew it firsthand, and nobody else was doing the editing. Now, the same thing as the socialist worker so-called newspaper shows, it is completely racist, completely disconnected from the lives and the battles of the African and Asian people and other victims of racism in the country, as it is disconnected from the grassroots of the campaign against sexism and women's rights. And about women's rights, the SWP is known as having covered up allegations, alleged rapes by its members against women members of the SWP. Now, the SWP surfaced in 2003, 2004 in the Mile End Road that pretended to be for the revolutionary. I'm saying it is within a quotation mark, the word revolutionary guise of opposing Tony Blair. And that was actually what they were saying when they were kind of latching onto the then, quote, notoriously kicked out of Labour Party by Blair, George Galloway. Of course, now Galloway is no longer anywhere in political terms in the British politics. But at that time, Galloway and the SWP were among the conspirators, all of them racist whites, to exploit the, quote, Muslim aspect of the Bangladeshis in Tower Hamlets. And what happened? Galloway desperately needed to have a constituency he could stand for election from, because he had tried to re-stand after being kicked out of the Labour Party by Tony Blair. He tried to stand again, that is, from one of the constituencies in Scotland, where he had been an MP from for most of his time as, quote, MP. But Galloway found that he would not get anywhere near getting elected. So the most important tactical strategic location Galloway and the SWP liars kind of chose and settled on was Tower Hamlets. And the constituency of the two constituencies in Tower Hamlets, the one that they chose was the one that had the most prospect of, if you like, electoral success. Why? Because that was held by Oona King. O-N-A, Oona King, K-I-N-G, King. So Oona King was MP for Bethnal Green and Bow. She had been one of Tony Blair's babes, as they were called, at the May 1997 election. We shall discuss in detail Oona King's political career another time, but this one is about the SWP and their collusion with George Galloway. Now they decided that Oona King, who was a Blairite, would be a useful target to choose, and she could be thrown out if the Bangladeshis in the constituency could be persuaded to treat George Galloway as a liberator, as a hero, as a savior of the Palestinians. And Galloway performed absolutely on cue and to the program. He was so successful in kind of parading himself as a friend of the Palestinians and the Muslims that he was held on the shoulders of people in Brick Lane as a kind of acknowledgement of his being the white savior. Now, George Galloway and the SWP, once they got elected, they got George Galloway elected in May 2005. That was because of the Bangladeshis deciding to kick Oona King out. So the Bangladeshis decided to arrange for Galloway to be elected. And as a member of the Labour Party, I had my kind of part, nothing to do with giving George Galloway any opportunity, but in exposing Una King for the kind of corrupt, selfish, ignorant, kind of incumbent that she was, because she lied. And she lied nothing to do with the Palestinians, but she lied about praising Tower Hamlets Council in her PMQ's intervention to Blair, inviting him in June 1998, 17th June 1998 PMQs. She congratulated Tower Hamlets Council, and I challenged her afterwards to substantiate the reason for her challenging. And she first denied that she had actually congratulated Tower Hamlets Council, which is a lie because it is still on the Hansard. So that lie and her kind of false invitation at the PMQs to Tony Blair to praise Tower Hamlets Council was enough for me to do the necessary to expose her, which I did. Now, after we exposed and undermined Una King politically, she was a kind of liability for the Labour Party, and the Labour Party knew it. And that was taken advantage of by the supporters of Galloway, and the rest is, as they say, history. Galloway got in. And when Galloway got in, he had already a very considerably large head, big head, as they say. His head expanded to beyond almost explosion point. And he began to be so confident about his importance to the people of the constituency that he neglected the Khoodeelaar campaign's main campaign Khoodeelaar was running against the Crossrail project, the whole. And he instead arranged for himself to be paid any amount of money. I don't know exactly how much money he pocketed, but he sold his kind of political reputation, as it were, in exchange for money, and appeared as a guest in the Big Brother house that was being aired by Channel 4 in January 2006. So that is the kind of contempt shown to the community by the just elected member of parliament from Bethnal Green and Bow. And this is the person who then went on to proceed to table any number of early day motions, EDMs, early day motions. They're the motions that are submitted by hopeless kind of proposers, because early day motions hardly ever get debated in the House of Commons, let alone get passed. If there has been any, that would be a very small kind of exception. And looking at, as I said earlier this week, the early day motions record of Jeremy Corbyn, and looking at George Galloway's early day motions during his time as MP at the expense of Bethnal Green and Bow, it is quite clear that George Galloway and Jeremy Corbyn had no clue as to what they were doing in terms of the constituency's needs and democracy, because they were abusing the early day motion option to table any kind of idiotic, irrelevant to their constituency issues. In fact, one of the EDMs tabled included a demand for the support of Lutfur Rahman, who had been already or just recently discredited. Of course, that early motion supporting Lutfur Rahman got nowhere. But the fact that it was on the table It was on the kind of log, helped to understand where these people like the George Galloway and Jeremy Corbyn did their politics, their democracy. George Galloway openly abused the Muslim community in Bradford West, as he did in Bethnal Green and Bow, because he never, ever raised any issue in Parliament based on the ordinary experience of the electors in the constituency. The fact that he did speak in Parliament on more than one occasion about Crossrail, once on the 19th of July 2005 and once in June 2006, was nothing to do with George Galloway, let alone his colluders in 2003 and 4, the SWP, supporting the constituency. It was to do with the fact that the Khoodeelaar campaign had created an absolutely overwhelmingly undeniable, powerful movement against Crossrail in the constituency. And it had to be recognized, and Galloway recognized it in his own way, but he insulted the constituency in the course of this spiel. He spoke in Parliament and he said that his being an MP in the name of Bethnal Green and Bow was his latest detour. Now that was absolutely insulting, because Galloway never would have been an MP after Tony Blair kicked him out if it wasn't for the fact of the constituency of Bethnal Green and Bow. Because Galloway cannot get elected anywhere. He has tried getting elected as what? As a kind of mayor of London, or touted himself as a possible rival to or contender against the then mayor of Newham, Robin Wales, and assorted other things, including trying to become a candidate for Parliament. Guess what? For Nigel Farage, the fascist, anti-Muslim, criminal inciter. And he failed, and he stood in other parts in Greater Manchester or thereabouts, and he failed. So it's not just one example, it's all the examples put together show that Galloway is unelectable. The only time he can get elected and could get elected were the two times. One was in Bethnal Green and Bow, and the other time was in Bradford West. Both of the occasions, he overstated his affiliation to Muslims, which is completely bogus. He otherwise has not identified in solidarity with the Muslims in this country, nor has he made any case against the racist incitement by Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson et al. In fact, he has been a praiser of Nigel Farage and of Boris Johnson. And he has been a Brexiteer, which is the cause that Boris Johnson kind of gave extra impetus to by attacking Muslims. That is, the Turkish nation would descend on Britain if Britain didn't leave the UK. So the SWP, George Galloway, Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage are on the one side, on the other side, on the side of the racists. There may be distinction, differences, distances among them, but they're not on the side of the people attacked by racists, demonized by racists, obstructed by racists, and denied a voice by racists. When George Galloway stood again for election from Bradford West, he got severely reminded of his lack of appeal to the community. He didn't have anything to sell politically because he had defamed a number of Muslims in the constituency, and he had abused a number of people in the constituency. That is not the behavior of a person who respects the community. And that is what the SWP do. The SWP are a racist organization, and George Galloway colluded with the SWP when it suited him. And then when he had used them and they had used him enough for the purpose of each, they denounced each other. And George Galloway made his case even worse by coming back to Tower Hamlets in 2014, in November 2014, after hardly 10 days after Eric Pickles, then communities minister, had appointed a group of commissioners to take over Tower Hamlets Council, following the publication of the report that showed that Lutfur Rahman had abused his position as mayor and had given money to people in the community that had nothing to do with any service to the community or complying with the procedures for transparency and accountability, but it's solely as bribes so that they would support him. George Galloway surfaced at the Water Lily Center in the first fortnight of November 2014, where he co-appeared with Ken Lying Still Livingston. And he, Galloway, made a bold claim. He said that it was down to him as the leader who set the example for a Bangladeshi to become elected to the UK House of Commons for the first time ever. He said that it was him, that the Bangladeshis had to be grateful to him. Quite how he worked that out is beyond reasonable kind of test and evidence, because Bangladeshis did not need George Galloway or anybody else to set an example for them to become a candidate or get elected to any democratic institution within the democratic kind of arrangements that exist in Britain. I got elected by the community, of course, but it's an extension. It's only one form. I got elected as far back as 1982 from the community in Tower Hamlets to represent the community on the Inner London Education Authority. Now that was 1982. And I don't think that George Galloway was an MP in 1982, but it can be checked and verified. And I got elected by the students, which is not very different from an ordinary parliamentary constituency. Students of what is now the University of East London. I got the overwhelming majority in the election in 1976. Where was George Galloway in 1976? And I'm a Bangladeshi. And I got elected on both those occasions. Let me see where George Galloway was in 1976. Now, George Galloway in the entry here is reported as being born on the 16th of August, 1954. So in 1954, he was born, 64 he was 10, 74 he was 20. So he was 22 years old when I was elected by the students of what is now the University of East London. So let's see when he got elected as MP the first time. So he got elected 5 years after I got elected to the Inner London Education Authority. So he got elected on the 12th of June 1987 for Glasgow Kelvin. So he wasn't anywhere in any comparable or known elected position, known that is known in public through this entry on the Wikipedia. So how dare Galloway address the whole of the Bangladeshi community? I had been refusing offers to stand as parliamentary candidate or as council candidate for years, since the 70s. How dare he include me as one of the people who would have otherwise not got a chance to get elected without him, setting an example in 2005 for the first time. For decades, I had been saying no, and I'm still saying no to careerist political position, either as a member of parliament or as a member of a local council or anything. I believe, as Galloway knows, because I told him in 2006 that I oppose my candidature because being a candidate undermines my work as a campaigner on principle and morality, on ethics. Not just him, but 2 or 3 of his racist colleagues who were present in a restaurant in Brick Lane where I first spoke to Galloway after saving his kind of career following his scandalous appearance at the guest of Channel 4 Big Brother House. Now, all of this is part of the discussion of the Daily Mirror, remember? The left newspaper Daily Mirror is as bad, as detached from the left politics as are the white anti-racists who claim to be against racism but who are actually obstructive of black people organizing against racism in a democratic way, in a fair and universally transparent way in this country, in the UK. By black people, I of course include Muslims, Africans, Asians, all the other people. Galloway has exploited the ignorance of some of the people in the communities and has jumped on the back of a van or back of a truck and stood as the personification of the Palestinians' savior in Britain. Let me tell anyone watching this, including Galloway, that the people of South Africa, the black people of South Africa, had all kinds of anti-apartheid solidarity outfits operating in the UK. But none of these did the battles and none of these overthrew the apartheid. It was the ground battle that the black people had to fight. Similarly, every time there is a racist obstruction, racist prejudice, racist lie, racist collusion, racist defamation of any Asian or African genuinely active campaigner against racism in Britain or in the USA, it is the victims, it's the targets of the racist obstruction, defamation, lying that are doing the battle, not the careerist, opportunist, white privileged kind of careerists that intervene and try to exploit the position, or they are stooges from the black community. There are stooges like the mental slave, terrible Phillips. So what is happening with the Daily Mirror? Not talking about the councillors in Poplar or the Poplar councillors is not an accident. This is the general kind of tendency the Daily Mirror kind of follows. And this one, we need more help. Sums up what I've been saying about local councils. The councils are using the virus as if it were poverty, because the councils, as I have said, create a quota and a volume and a sum of poverty and homelessness in order to use that as part of the bargaining with the central government over funding, because central government in the UK has to fund the local councils for various services. Not everything, but majority of the services are run by the money from public sources. One is the council tax and the other is the central government funding. Now this is typical kind of slogan. And this is not something that is democratic, because these leaders, this headline is attributed to the leaders of the kind of councils or regional councils and metro mayors, as it were. And these are people that are making their own pitch against the UK central government now over the lockdown. And they're doing that mainly on the ground of resource. Now, if they're talking about resources, then where is the account? Where is the publicly published accounts of the expenditure every year by each local council? There isn't. What there is a kind of inspection of the accounts, but that is like going through hell. It's like Armageddon. You have to be a real kind of masochist to kind of want to inspect the council's accounts. It's not available. It's not on the publicly available, and you cannot check it. You have to go there, register yourself as if you have committed a series of crimes, and then queue there and spend more than one day looking at the kind of so-called token accounts. So therefore, there is a built-in criminality of obstruction against accessibility of information by the electors in every council area. It's not democratic, it's not transparent, and it most certainly isn't helpful in understanding the emergency and the urgency of the need for services at a time like this. And what I said about Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson supporting the same narrative applies to this as well, because there is no demand from the Labour Party to change this Armageddon obstruction to accessing how the council spends the money. So the Labour Party is as corrupt as the Conservative Party. So we shall be coming to part 3 and continuing with a look at the daily Boris graph, which is featuring as the page 1 picture of the Finance Minister Rishi Sunak.